Alright guys, we're going to fight the American Revolution in Chapter 6. So this is from 1775 to 1783. There we go. So let's talk about the question of independence and some armed conflict that's going to erupt. The Sons of Liberty continued to encourage resistance to British actions as local militia stockpiled weapons and kept a watch on British troop movements. Women continued the boycotts, and they also made bandages and bullets. Some northern colonists freed slaves who agreed to serve in the militia. On April 18, 1775, British troops left Boston and marched to Lexington and Concord to confiscate Patriot war material stored there and to arrest the Patriot leaders. Paul Revere and others were able to spread the alarm, alerting the residents of Lexington and Concord. On April 19th, British troops encountered militiamen on Lexington's village green. 8 colonists were killed in the brief exchange before the troops moved to Concord, where they burned colonial supplies. But what they did at Lexington gave them time to move the stored stuff. They didn't burn everything at Concord. It gave them enough time to get some of the war material out of Concord. Militiamen from neighboring towns harassed the British soldiers all the way back to Boston by hiding behind trees and fences and firing on them as they marched, eventually killing 73 and wounding 200. As word spread, Boston Patriots attacked British soldiers, forcing their initial retreat onto ships in the harbor. The British soon regained control of Boston, only to find that Patriot militiamen were entrenched on the hills north of the city. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont quickly captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The War for Independence had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May, and certain delegates, such as John Dickinson, wanted to step back and consider a negotiation with Great Britain to prevent total separation. Others believed that independence was the only possible response now that the armed conflict had begun. On June 16th, British forces under the command of General William Howe dislodged the Patriots holding Breed's Hill and Bunker's Hill just north of Boston. The British won the day when the Patriots ran out of ammunition, but their victory was extremely costly. More than 1,000 British soldiers were either killed or wounded. The British had held Boston, but their heavy losses encouraged the Patriots. There we go. So this is just an image of the Battle of Bunker Hill. So you can see Boston on one side, Charleston on the other, fighting going on. So how about we build ourselves a Continental Army? That's what Congress wanted to do. Remember, Congress is just a meeting of people. So anytime you hear the word Congress, it usually also insinuates we're going to be meeting and talking about stuff. So Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. On June 23rd, he left Philadelphia to take command of the troops in Boston. Washington had to depend on local militia leaders to accept his leadership and on individual colonies to supply the troops. Washington wrote dozens of letters to Continental Congress delegates, Patriot leaders, and others begging for supplies and also for men. He tried to improve military discipline and order by replacing incompetent officers and combating the troops for their, the troops like to drink, they like to gamble, they like to fight with militiamen from other areas, and he's going to try to stop all that. Washington and his officers developed a 2-pronged military strategy. The first was to drive the British out of Boston. The second was to capture Canada to prevent the attack from the north. All right. So in November 1775, Patriot General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal, but cold weather, an outbreak of smallpox, and a lack of reinforcements doomed the Patriots' attack on Quebec. So for General Henry Knox, he retrieved cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga to shore up Patriot defenses in Boston. In the Battle of Dorchester Heights, Washington surprised the British with a cannon bombardment, driving the British out of Boston and up to Nova Scotia. But there are some reasons for caution, and there are also reasons for action. War had spread into Virginia by 1775 as Lord Dunmore, the colony's royal governor, sought refuge on British warships in Norfolk Harbor. So he has to actually leave the mainland and go out to his ship in the middle of the harbor for protection. He encouraged slaves and servants to join him, and thousands are going to. When Dunmore led his army at the Battle of Great Bridge in November, of 1775, many black men fought alongside the British troops, and after reclaiming his mansion, Dunmore issued a proclamation that guaranteed freedom to any slave or indentured servant who agreed to fight for the British. It's known as Dunmore's Proclamation, and it alarmed Patriot leaders because it complicated the drive for independence. Plantation owners and other wealthy men, many of whom were delegates to the Second Continental Congress, did not want to upset the existing social and economic hierarchy in the process of securing independence for themselves. So many colonists still hoped for negotiated settlement, but those hopes receded when Parliament and the King refused to compromise, cutting off trade and prohibiting negotiations with the colonies in December of 1775. So now we're going to hear for calls of independence beginning to intensify in 1776, especially after the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which quickly became a bestseller. You can go back and you can read a couple of excerpts from Common Sense in your book. But independence became a greater possibility as colonies began to instruct their delegates to the Second Continental Congress to support separation from Great Britain. The Congress officially asked France for military and economic support and advised colonies to establish governments independent of British control. The spread of war and the arguments set forth in Common Sense convinced many that it was time to declare independence. So in June of 1775, Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion for independence in the Continental Congress. There's a lot of debate that's going to go on, and Congress is going to appoint John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to write a formal statement justifying independence. Thomas Jefferson is going to become the lead writer, and he drew on ideas from a variety of sources. You've probably heard about the influence of Thomas Paine to the many declarations written by local groups and colonial assemblies. And many of these documents, they drew upon the writings of John Locke, who argued that sovereignty rested with the people, and thus the people could change any government that abuses its powers and threatens their right to life, liberty, and property. Locke's principles of sovereignty became a central argument in what would become the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was debated and edited by the Second Continental Congress. All references to slavery were removed, but listed among the King's abuses was the charge of inciting domestic insurrections amongst us, a reference to Dunmore's proclamation. All colonies, with the exception of New York, approved the Declaration on July 2nd, 1776, and the Declaration was made public on July 4th. So we had been fighting, guys, for almost 18 months before we actually declare our independence. Before the outbreak of war, Patriots and Loyalists had chosen sides. Patriots are going to be for independence. Loyalists are going to be those who remain loyal to the King. Patriots organized local committees, courts, and assemblies to govern the colonies as they shed British rule. Servants and slaves fled to British warships or marched with British troops in Virginia. Mohawk Loyalists, led by Joseph Brant, relocated to Canada with 120 British Loyalists and British Superintendent for Indian Affairs Guy Johnson. Representatives from the Continental Congress, recognizing the importance of Indian support, met with the Iroquois Confederacy in August of 1775. Some Oneida Indians wanted to support the colonies, but most wanted to remain neutral. Once the Declaration of Independence was signed and made public, the pressure to choose sides increased, particularly among the civilian population. Loyalist civilians, those that were loyal to the King and didn't want independence, they were able to resettle in New York, Newport, and Charleston because the British controlled those cities for much of the war. Men of fighting age reinforced British troops, but others, particularly women, were at great risk. Without the support of British troops, Loyalists were attacked and their homes were ransacked. Loyalists came from all social and economic classes. Many tenants in the Hudson Valley in New York were Loyalists because their landlords were patriots. They wanted to go against their landlord. In the South, former regulators joined forces with the British in opposition to North Carolina's eastern elite, toward whom they were still hostile. Most Indian nations sided with the British, and the Mohawk, Seneca, Cherokee, and Creek nations were some of Britain's most important allies. Most Indian nations believed that Great Britain offered them the best chance to secure their territory in North America, in spite of the failure of the Proclamation Line of 1763. This is Colonel Guy Johnson, just to give you an idea, and one of the Indian allies. Many Indian nations like the Delaware and the Shawnee tried to remain neutral, but when patriots refused to recognize their neutrality, even killing the Shawnee chief Cornstalk under a flag of truce, they sided with the British. Colonists who chose neutrality for religious reasons were also threatened. 80,000 Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Shakers, and Moravians, the majority of them in Pennsylvania, embraced pacifism and refused to take up arms or pay taxes to support the war. Their pacifism made them suspect to both sides. In 1778, 9 Mennonite farmers refused to swear allegiance to Pennsylvania's new revolutionary government. They were jailed, and their property and possessions were confiscated and sold. Quakers were also fined and imprisoned, and those Quakers who supported one side or the other were often disowned or disciplined by their Quaker meetings for violating Quaker principles. Betsy Ross and her husband were among those affected. Once independence was declared, all those who actively supported the American cause would be considered traitors if the Patriots did not win. Most traitors are going to be hanged. Soldiers' families were particularly affected as the Continental Army took them further away from home. Old men and young boys were the only protection for local communities. Some women accompanied their husbands as camp followers. These women cooked, did laundry, and sewed for the soldiers. The women who remained at home raised money, gathered information, and sent supplies to the front line. Desperately short of supplies, the Continental Army asked Northern women to make clothes and Southern women to plant crops for food. Women in Hartford, Connecticut produced 1,000 coats and vests and 1,600 shirts in 1 year. Other women converted their homes into makeshift hospitals, nursing soldiers with battle wounds and various diseases. African American women, such as Phyllis Whitley, who's pictured there, she's from Boston. She supported the Patriots. She sent a collection of poems to General Washington and urged her readers to see Africans as children of God. She was freed by her master, but she was an exception. Most Black Americans remained enslaved in the South, other than those slaves who fled to the British side. En route from Boston, so we're going to talk about fighting for independence now, 1776 through 1777. So en route from Boston to New York in 1776, many soldiers in Washington's army deserted, believing that New Yorkers should defend New York. The only ones who remained with Washington were landless laborers whose wives also came as camp followers, much to Washington's. He didn't like that at all. Washington arrived in New York with 19,000 poorly armed and poorly trained soldiers, some of whom had been drafted into service by their local leaders. In New York, the Continentals faced a larger and better trained army, while the powerful British Navy was anchored in New York Harbor or off the coast of Long Island. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence, General Howe had ordered 10,000 troops to occupy New York in the hope that such an overwhelming show of force would convince the Continental Congress to accept his offer of a royal pardon. It doesn't work, though. Howe's plan was to control New York City and march up the Hudson Valley, isolating New York and New England from other colonies. He had the support of some 8,000 Hessian mercenaries and naval reinforcements. When the British engaged with the Continental Army on Long Island in August 1776, more than 1,500 of Washington's troops were killed or wounded. By November, the British had captured Fort Lee in New Jersey and attacked the Patriot Army at Fort Washington, north of New York City. Aided by a large community of loyalists, Howe's men raided and looted the homes and businesses of local patriots. Washington's army escaped into Pennsylvania, and the Continental Congress fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. Howe hoped to wear the Continental Army down rather than pursue an aggressive military strategy, and he wanted the colonies to sue for peace. Washington hoped that by avoiding full-scale frontal assaults, he would convince the British that the colonies would be too difficult to defeat. So between July and December of 1776, the Continental Army did not win a single battle. Howe decided not to pursue Washington into Pennsylvania, choosing instead to set up winter quarters in New York and wait until spring to fight again, in keeping with European tradition. You don't fight during the winter. This plan allowed Washington to regroup, but he was not looking forward to facing the winter with troops suffering from a very low morale. Crossing the Delaware River from eastern Pennsylvania, Washington successfully attacked Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Eve. Then, on January 3rd, 1777, the Continentals defeated the British at Princeton. The British retreated from New Jersey, and the Continental Congress came back to Philadelphia. In the spring of 1770, the British Army was concentrated in New York City and Canada. The Continental Army was in Morristown, New Jersey. The Continental Congress was afraid the British would try to capture Philadelphia and split the colonies in half. Howe believed that the capture of Philadelphia would cause Washington to surrender, and the Continental Army, though too small to defeat Howe's army, delayed his march from New York to Philadelphia through repeated attacks. Howe received an order to reinforce General John Burgoyne's forces moving south from Canada, but he did not turn around, continuing to Philadelphia and capturing the city in September of 1777. Although Burgoyne recaptured Fort Ticonderoga in July, his forces stalled while waiting for supplies and reinforcements. General Barry St. Leger was moving east through New York with the help from local Indians, but he suffered a major defeat at the hands of German-American farmers led by Nicholas Herkimer with help from reinforcements under the command of General Benedict Arnold. By the end of August, the British and Indian troops had retreated to Canada. With no help from St. Leger or Howe, Burgoyne's troops faced the Continental Army, the Green Mountain Boys, and their own native allies alone. General Arnold and General Horatio Gates defeated Burgoyne in 2 battles at Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne surrendered to Gates after the Battle of Saratoga. And that battle at Saratoga, the American victory there, encouraged the Patriots, and it really stunned the British. It undercut Howe's capture of Philadelphia and indicated that Howe failed to understand the nature of the American Revolution. As American troops settled in at Valley Forge for the winter, Washington was encouraged, as were the members of the dislocated Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin, already in Paris, France, now had greater hope for securing French help. Just a map there to give you an idea of where all these attacks are going on, coming in from, and then, sailing down the coast, up the rivers, all these little American victories, British victories that you see kind of spread throughout here. So, Patriots are going to gain some critical assistance, and despite the victories in the fall of 1777, the winter at Valley Forge almost doomed the Patriot effort. Bitter cold, inadequate food and clothing, and poor training led to a breakdown in discipline. Benjamin Franklin recruited Baron Frederick von Steuben to drill the army during the winter. Other Europeans also helped the Patriots. Although the army still had problems with discipline and other issues, the foreign volunteers and Washington's leadership helped the Patriot cause. So you have like the Marquis de Lafayette. We have a couple of some counts that come over, some more barons. So we have a lot of European help to kind of whip into shape this Continental Army. Women and families on the home front also suffered in 1777 through 1778. In Philadelphia, British soldiers commandeered private homes. Women whose husbands fought in the Continental Army had to provide for themselves and their families. Many women funded voluntary associations like the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia to help provide resources for the army in hopes of shortening the conflict. Camp followers provided vital services to the army and suffered alongside them. There were cooks, laundresses, seamstresses, and nurses. And they also benefited from the supplies like clothing and bedding sent by urban women. Courageous women with resources acted as spies and couriers for both armies. They eavesdropped on enemy conversations and passed along the information they gathered. In one case, a Georgia woman tricked Tory soldiers into losing sight of their guns and killed 2 of them before her neighbors arrived to hang the others. Women like Margaret Corbin followed their husbands into the battlefield and took over their positions if their husbands died. Others like Deborah Sampson dressed as men and enlisted in the Continental Army. And just a really good Netflix series. It's on Netflix now. It was on, I can't remember the network that it was on, but it's Turn, Washington Spies. You guys should watch that if you haven't. It was on AMC. There we go. So, surviving on the home front, well, all those women and children, whether slave or free, they faced a lot of hardships and insecurities. Farm women added field labor to their domestic chores. In cities, women scrambled for scarce food and supplies, always afraid that they would not be able to feed their children. As battles were fought throughout the colonies, women watched both armies destroy or confiscate precious foodstuffs and livestock to keep them out of their enemies' hands. Women's homes were looted, their servants or slaves were kidnapped or liberated, and in some cases they were raped. Most women developed new survival skills. When merchants hoarded supplies in hopes of raising prices, women raided stores and warehouses and just took what they needed. Others kept detailed accounts of damage to their homes, farms, and businesses to submit to local officials. Increasingly, women of all classes joined together to help each other and those in poverty and to provide bandages, clothes, food, and bullets to the army. The Continental Congress acted so let's talk about governing in revolutionary times for a second, okay? So the Continental Congress, they acted as the national government for most of the war, but it had to rely on the states for money and manpower. So there's no like central authority, right? So delegates drafted the Articles of Confederation in 1777, and 8 states had ratified them by June of 1778. It was 1781, however, before all 13 states had ratified the document. The absence of an effective national government during the interim meant that the state governments were crucial throughout the war. Some colonies had formed state governments even before independence was declared, and some simply followed the regulations in their colonial charters or relied on English common law. Delaware, South Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania created new governments based on written constitutions. These constitutions, they were hastily written, though, and sometimes by legislators without authorization and with no provisions for obtaining popular approval. The state constitutions reflected colonists' fear of that centralized government. Patriot in Pennsylvania created a radical constitution that gave great power to the state legislature and ordinary voters while limiting the power of the executive branch. There was not a governor, and the unicameral legislature had term limits. Other states also limited centralized power to some extent. Most states attached a Bill of Rights to their constitutions following the example of Virginia. Common rights were freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of elections, the right to a trial by jury, the right to form militia and bear arms, and equal protection under the law. New Jersey's constitution, written in 1776, enfranchised women, gave them right to vote, and it also freed blacks who met certain property requirements. Most state constitutions, so this divide over slavery, most of the state constitutions did not address slavery. Only Vermont's constitution abolished slavery in 1777. Pennsylvania delegates enacted a gradual emancipation law that freed slaves born after 1780 when they reached 28 years of age. 2 slaves, Walker and Mumbet, sued for their freedom in Massachusetts in 1781 and 1780. Mumbet won her case and renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman. Walker's own appeal at the local court's decision in his slaves' favor, but the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that slavery was inconsistent with the state constitution, ensuring Walker too was freed. During the Revolutionary War, conditions for Southern slaves got increasingly harsh because the British had offered freedom to slaves who escaped and fought with the Redcoats. However, thousands of those who escaped were left undefended when the British forces retreated. Many blacks believed that the revolutionary ideals of the American Revolution were inconsistent with slavery. Northern free black communities, particularly those in seaport cities, grew rapidly because jobs were plentiful. Southern slaves gained freedom either by joining the British or by taking advantage of the chaos of the war to escape. 1/4 of South Carolina slaves had freed themselves by the end of the war, but as the framework for a national government was developing, few legislators viewed the abolition of slavery as a vital issue. So we do get an ally, though. The Continental Congress considered an alliance with France more important than abolishing slavery because France could provide badly needed financial and military support. In December of 1776, the Continental Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France as an unofficial representative of the new United States. His popularity made him successful in procuring the supplies the colonies needed. A formal alliance was initially out of the question, but after the American victory at Saratoga, King Louis XVI agreed to an alliance that created trading rights between the United States and France and its colonies. France recognized the independence of the United States, gave up claims to North America, and sent troops to help the Continental Army. The United States agreed to defend France's Caribbean holdings. Spain allied with France a year later. So Great Britain is going to declare war on France, ensuring that the war would expand beyond North America as France attacked British outposts around the world. Britain's war expenditures rose exponentially. French military officers, weapons, money, and ships continued to aid the American cause. In response to the alliance between France and the United States, Lord North, Britain's Prime Minister, concentrated British troops in New York City, meaning that Philadelphia returned to American control in mid-1778. For the rest of the war, New York served as a supply center and prisoner of war camp for the British. So how do they raise armies and funds? When Americans learned that the impending arrival of French troops, fewer men volunteered for the army, while others took the offered bounty and never reported for duty. The local officials who implemented the draft accepted substitutes for draftees, resulting in slave, landless laborers, and mentally or physically unfit men joining the army. With the conflict spreading south and west by 1779, enrollments fell even more. The troops were stretched thin and faced danger, food and material shortages, and capture. The British held Patriot prisoners of war in New York City jails or on ships in the harbor, and the conditions were filthy and the guards were abusive. Between 8,000 and 11,500 prisoners died in captivity. The Continental Congress could not help the prisoners or their families because it was under severe financial constraints. It could not levy taxes, so it had to find other ways to raise money. So they looked to wealthy patriots and looked for a loan. And these wealthy patriots do loan the nation money, as did France and the Netherlands, and Congress printed some $200 million of its own currency by 1780. The continental dollars depreciated quickly, however, and most citizens used the more widely circulated state currencies. Uprising in Philadelphia demonstrated the problems caused by rapid inflation. Although authorities tried to regulate prices, merchants were believed to be hoarding goods in January of 1779. The finances of the Congress improved slightly when it issued certificates to wealthy patriots backed by a $6 million loan from France. States raised taxes to meet their financial obligations, but the rapid inflation made these taxes increasingly burdensome and unpopular, and financial stability remained elusive. We are going to skip over this part just for time's sake. It talks about Indian affairs and some land claims. We're also going to skip over the fighting in the West, but you are more than welcome to read through these. It gives you an idea, a visual representation of the war in the West and in the South. Just really quickly, the British, so the war is raging in the West and it moves to the South. The British, they had wanted to regain control of the South from Georgia all the way up to Virginia, and they're able to capture Savannah, Georgia, and eventually all of Georgia. General Clinton left the command to Lord Charles Cornwallis after being called north to confront Washington and the Continental Army in New Jersey. Charleston, South Carolina surrendered in 1780. Cornwallis evicted patriots from the city, purged the state government, established military control, and required loyalty oaths from all men able to fight. General Gates is then going to march south with his Continentals to join militiamen from Virginia and North Carolina. And on August 16th, Cornwallis was victorious over Gates and the Patriots because they were malnourished and exhausted, and this is at Camden, South Carolina. Soon after news of the defeat reached Washington, he learned of the defection of Benedict Arnold, commander at West Point. So Benedict Arnold, he's a turncoat. If you don't know much about him, look him up online. He's known as the first traitor of the United States and sells us out to the British because he had been overlooked for positions, and the British will promise him a better position and better pay if he will surrender West Point and some other give up some strategic locations. The news from South Carolina and West Point, it strengthened hope for a British victory, and most of Clinton's forces were in New York City, and he planned to send troops to support Cornwallis as necessary. With Loyalist help, Cornwallis controlled Georgia and South Carolina. Patriot morale and resources were low, and the Continental soldiers in the North began to mutiny in 1780 over their pay and terms of enlistment. So, luck, leadership, and the French, so that's really going to help the Patriots come out of this. In October of 1780, 800 sharpshooters routed Loyalist forces at Kings Mountain in South Carolina, a feat that kept Cornwallis from advancing and gave the Patriots a chance to regroup. So after Kings Mountain, General Nathanael Greene replaced Gates as head of the Southern Army. Greene took the advice of local militia leaders such as Daniel Morgan and Francis Marion and subdivided his army into smaller and more suitable units. And after picking up volunteers in the backcountry, Morgan's unit drew Tarleton's forces into a trap at Cowpens. 100 British soldiers died and 800 were captured. Cornwallis then tries to pursue the retreating Continentals, but his troops outran their cannons, allowing Greene to attack them at Guilford Courthouse. Although the British won the battle, they suffered massive casualties. So Cornwallis is then going to set up camp at Yorktown, Virginia, and he's going to wait for reinforcements to come down from New York. Washington coordinated his next move with the French. Continental troops moved south to surround Yorktown on land, and the French Navy sailed from the West Indies to prevent the English Navy from resupplying Cornwallis. So then by October, Cornwallis's supplies had run out and reinforcements were not forthcoming, and the British army is going to surrender October 19, 1781. After the surrender at Yorktown, and while negotiations were underway, British troops harassed Continental troops in New York City. Many Continental soldiers were eager to collect overdue wages, and they mutinied when the Congress disbanded the army in 1783 without providing back pay. 300 troops marched on Philadelphia, and Washington sent his own troops to put down the mutiny. Bloodshed was avoided when the Congress agreed to pay the soldiers half of what they were owed in currency and the other half in certificates. The issue of back pay continued to plague the country for the next 10 years. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay were negotiating peace terms. The British public's increasing dissatisfaction with the war, especially after the defeat of Yorktown, forced the British to sue for peace. The French were unwilling to accept the Americans as political equals because the Congress had instructed its delegates to supply with French wishes. France controlled the negotiations and prevented a separate treaty between America and Great Britain. The peace treaty, when finalized, was beneficial to America, though. The British recognized American independence, ceding all land south of Canada and north of Louisiana and Florida from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Spain is going to regain control of Florida. None of the Indian allies of either the British or the Americans were consulted, though. The Treaty of Paris led to an exodus of British troops and loyalists from the United States. They relocated to Canada, the West Indies, or Great Britain. Troops occupying forts on the western frontier did not leave for many years and continued to cause problems between U.S. settlers and local Indians. Former slaves who had fought with the British were given their freedom, and many of them initially resettled in Nova Scotia, where they received small plots of land but little else. The small Afro-Canadian community grew despite obstacles, but others are going to migrate to Sierra Leone. So it was a surprising victory. The Americans were able to defeat the British because the war was fought on American soil and because fighting Indians and the French had prepared them for fighting the British. The British Army could not maintain its supply lines, and its officers were afraid to make independent decisions, handing control over to the people in London who failed to understand the actual conditions of fighting in North America. Although both sides relied on the help of allies, the Hessians and the Indian allies of the British began looking out for their own interests when the British began to lose. America's allies, France and Spain, were willing to help the Patriots and themselves in the process. To be successful in putting down the American Revolution, the British had to conquer each colony separately. Because the Patriots had the support of a large civilian population as well as the Continental Army, this proved impossible to do.